Good morning. I call to order the October 2024 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in the West Committee Room. While today's meeting is not live streamed, the recording will be uploaded and archived to the board's YouTube channel after today's meeting. Just a quick reminder that here in the West Committee Room, we have room-wide microphones. So please make sure you're projecting when you speak, and I'll ask those in the audience to limit conversations. These are here just for looks. They serve no purpose. So we are going to start with our first item of business this morning, which is an opportunity for our committee to provide input into the criteria used for the Regent selection process. We will start by having Assistant Executive Director Marla Welshans walk us through the criteria used during the past election cycle. So Assistant Executive Director Welshans, please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Verhalen, members of the committee. Today's discussion will focus on the selection criteria, the selection process for Regents, but specifically on that criteria. So as a reminder, neither the university nor the board is involved in screening candidates or guiding the selection process. The region elections are entirely the responsibility and prerogative of the state legislature. Today's conversation is
a little bit so everybody in the back can hear you as well.
Today's conversation is simply input into that process. And so the primary objective today is to provide feedback on those criteria that are in your docket on page 4. I will note that that criteria was most recently majorly revised. So I understand that they did a significant revision for the 2018-2019 election cycle, and that the current criteria that's in the docket and that was used last time reflects those major revisions as well as some minor adjustments that they made in the meantime. So like past cycles, Regent Mayron, Executive Director Steves, they've been invited to attend the next October 29th RCAC meeting. They'll present on the qualities that the committee should look for in engaged and effective board members. So today's discussion will inform their presentation. And then in addition to these selection criteria, which today's focused on, of course, you can discuss anything about the selection process that the committee will be able to hear and either today while they're watching or on the YouTube afterwards. So with that, I will turn it back over to Chair Verhalen.
Thank you, Ms. Welshans. And those criteria, again, are on pages 4 and 5 of our materials today. If I'm counting correctly, there are 16. And so those are the criteria that we'll be covering as we go. But I am also pleased to welcome the chair of the Regent Candidate Advisory Council, Greg Clausen, and Vice Chair Barb Farrell. Thank you both for being here for this conversation. I would like to invite the two of you up if you'd like to make any comments or provide us with your perspectives, having served on the RCAC for a number of years. Yeah, so please feel free to come forward if you would like to. Yes. Yep, right up next to Marlo.
Start the meeting? As in begin?
Again, thank you both for being here. You're taking time out of your schedules not only to be here, but to aid in this process. And so thank you. And you've both served on the council for a long time, or for periods of time. I shouldn't say a long time because that's relative, right? But would love to hear some of your perspectives as you've looked at candidates over the years, as you've considered the process and things that we should keep in mind as well.
Would you like to start? Well, maybe just some comments. I think members of the group really understand the importance of the University of Minnesota to our state, and they take this process extremely seriously. Our goal is to get the very best people, the most qualified people, to serve on the Board of Regents, and that's always been our goal. We do have a series of expectations, you might say, what we're looking for in a candidate that we use as a guideline when we're looking for candidates. We do have a meeting, as you mentioned, on the 29th, where we'll be reviewing those expectations, those characteristics of a candidate, and reviewing those. Also, we have a nominating committee that will be then searching and working, and already is working, looking for candidates that would be interested to serve as a regent. So right now, we're using the criteria that we developed in the last round, and we'll, as I mentioned, be reviewing that on the 29th of October.
Yes.
I put you on the spot, and
I
I'm
know,
sorry.
we're starting the meeting, good gosh, but I, along with Greg, take the responsibility very seriously, and I think as members, we try very hard to do our very best job. I have seen members come to the committee who understand the process and are students of it and know what they're talking about, and I've seen people come to it sort of as I did when my legislator asked me if I would serve and knew of my interest in the university, and I had to learn very quickly how it all worked, or sometimes doesn't work. I mean, to the extent that we serve with trying to give the very best candidates for the legislature to elect them. I mean, we know what our role is and when we're done. It goes back and forth. One time, we're supposed to recommend 2 to 4 candidates. One time we heard very strongly, don't do our work for us. We want as many candidates as you can submit. That's 16 people knocking on the doors of the legislature trying to get time. And so we think, well, do we just submit what we think are our very best candidates? Well, that's 2. And then they go, yes, thank you for helping us. So to the extent that the legislators themselves are a dynamic and changing group, we get different instructions, and we try to do our very best with what we're being asked to do.
Yeah, and I think, we traditionally have this because we don't typically get to have a dialogue with members of the RCAC, so we really appreciate you being here. Typically, when we have this conversation, it's us in a vacuum talking about what we think are good qualifications to have as we round out our Board of Regents. Is there anything that, before we start that discussion, I'm taking a point of privilege as chair. Is there anything from your standpoint, if you don't have anything off the top of your head, we'll revisit this question at the end, but is there anything that you two would like to know about what we do that would be helpful in thinking through candidates as you go through this process? Is there anything that you would like to know about kind of what it is sitting in these seats that we're doing that might be helpful to you from a perspective?
One of the things that's been helpful, Chair Mayron usually comes, or at least the last couple rounds, comes to our initial meeting and talks about maybe there's some specific needs on the board that you're looking for, a person with some expertise in a particular area. So we do pay attention to that, and we think that's important to round out the board so that you have people that have expertise and can add to the discussion when you have specific topics that you're discussing. I sometimes, in serving in the Senate, felt very sorry for those of you that it's a daunting experience going through, as you know, meeting with senators, meeting with others, and going through that process. And one of the things that we have discussed and talking about is changing the process so you don't have people that show up at the joint convention or the joint meeting of the higher ed committees and nominate people that haven't gone through the process. And sometimes that's frustrating for us. And I think, too, the process has become politicized to some degree, and I think by making some changes that if you are going to nominate people, you have to have people from both parties, you have to have a certain percentage of people that support a candidate, trying to make some changes that we've talked about, and we've actually worked in the legislature to make some of those changes.
I've sometimes heard the process for the RCAC as being sort of this daunting, huge inspection of your lives, and I think the work you do is what's daunting. We get the chance to review your applications, invite you to interview each candidate for 45 minutes, and then make our recommendations to the legislature. And I've been in person for years in those conversations. And the questions are respectful. They're questions I try to be on point and interesting. And honestly, I think as RCAC members, we have a whole lot of respect for the candidates because candidates come to us with resumes and experience that's so impressive. We're honored to meet you and try to do the best job we can in advancing candidates. And then the candidate's responsibility to meet their legislators, that's when we do the handoff. So I think the work you do is what's daunting, not what we do.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll open the floor so we can start getting thoughts from other regions, but as we go along, I'll check in with both of you as well, and if there are questions others might have for you also, please, if you're willing to stay at the table, we would appreciate that. But, you know, when last time we had this conversation, which feels like a lifetime ago, but was only 2 years ago, we did talk about kind of the overall fabric of the board and different perspectives and thinking through where we're at now and where we want to go. And I think one place where we have an opportunity here, now I'm not super excited about this opportunity, but we have folks who have already said they're not running again for their positions. And so we know that we'll be losing that expertise that person carries. And so for me, I think right now we have a really fabulous set of perspectives at this board table. And when we're making these decisions and having these conversations, and you know, I especially think of someone like Regent Davenport, who comes to us with a perspective of an administrator in higher education, which is so important in what we're doing. Obviously, we have people who are doing that job now in our conversations and as part of what we're doing, but having someone who has done that in a different system or in the same system but in a different role, obviously, than where we are, is really valuable. And so I would like to make sure that, if possible, obviously you can't, you know, set the whole process, but I would like to make sure that we have that perspective still on the Board of Regents in some way. That's just my own personal perspective, and so I'll open the floor to others. Yeah, your name.
Thank you. For me, the criteria that currently governs the RCAC's work are wonderful criteria. I mean, they say it all, and they create a template for looking for and vetting people who, if they meet all or many of these criteria, you're going to be proposing fabulous people to the legislature for consideration. For me, the main issue is I would like to see, as Regent Verhalen pointed out, that somebody's paying attention to the various skill sets that we bring or experiences that we bring and trying to create that complement of different perspectives on the board. I do think our best decision-making comes when we bring different perspectives and we don't agree initially and we walk through the issues, and I think at the end of the day, we reach a better decision than we might if we all had carried the same perspective or the same skill set. And so I think that is very useful. As Regent Verhalen mentioned, I have indicated I won't be running again. One of the things I brought is my lawyer experience, which has been, I think, helpful from time to time, particularly when we're dealing with litigation and negotiations, but also the mediation experience or the governance experience. I have no substantive experience at all in higher ed, as Regent Davenport did, which brought a different perspective to us. And Regent Tarabi, each one of us, and Regent Kenyanya bring a different perspective. And so trying to bring forth candidates that have the differing perspectives and skill sets, I think is really important. That is, to me, more important than making sure we're getting, I realize there's some legislation that was proposed last year or in 2023 in the Senate where it was adding certain categories of individuals who should be on the Board of Regents. A tenured professor, someone from one of the employee unions here on campus, American Indian, but slotted people by their characteristics of maybe their employment or their certain characteristic that they have. And I don't think that captures what I would like to see, which is to have that broad perspective and different perspectives here. So that when I think about what I think you all ought to be looking for is, and what I would want to communicate to RCAC when we meet is, please look for people who, and mine the field for people who bring in different perspectives. Finance is huge. Having someone on our committee on the Regents who has a finance background is critical. Obviously, with what's going on in the healthcare area, critical that we had individuals who bring that skill set to the table in terms of the medical profession and healthcare generally. The other thing is, maybe you can share with us, or because I'll be going over, how do we communicate to the RCAC how, and I'll just be frank, disappointing when it gets politicized, when it feels like the slate is baked before you even come in to do your deliberations. People are voting basically on party lines, or so it appears, as opposed to really getting into the substance and the quality of the individuals. I will say, when I ran for Regent in 2018, I didn't feel that way. I felt like the RCAC was all about substance, and as I listened to the deliberations on it, it didn't feel politicized. Maybe it was, but it wasn't evident to me. Having watched a couple other rounds, that's not been the case, or at least by appearance-wise. So trying to impress on the RCAC about looking at substance, and please set aside your political, if you're at parties, and just look for the very best candidates. That to me is critical. So any input that you can provide on how to get that message across in a meaningful way to RCAC would be important. And my last question is, do you go out and, my memory is members of RCAC do go out and mine the field looking for candidates to apply. Is that still the case?
We do have a nomination committee, yes, that seeks qualified candidates. Yes.
So they go out in advance of when they're to try and find people to apply.
Yes, and we also do a lot of outreach with our legislators, asking them to do the same, looking for qualified candidates. We do some media reports, advertising, so to speak, Regent positions. I think when things get politicized is in the legislature, when when you go before the joint meeting of the higher ed committee and all of a sudden you get somebody nominated that perhaps nobody really knows who they are. And I think that's where the system breaks down and becomes more politicized. Also in the joint convention of the House and the Senate, where again, members can nominate people from the floor. And these are people that haven't gone through the vetting process, and it's just not a good situation. I think that's the area that, at least when I was in the legislature, tried to look at changing that to some degree. So you had more of a balance between the parties, that if you were going to nominate someone, you had to have support from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, I think another complicating factor is our requirement, and it's a good one, I think, but that our Board of Regents is made up of a representative from each of our congressional districts and 4 at-large positions. So there have been cycles where, depending on the congressional district, the amount of interest or the candidates are plentiful or not so much. And so we reach out to the legislators in those districts and say, and ask them and remind them of the upcoming responsibility, and see if, ask them for advice. We talked to the Minnesota Alumni Association. We have a meeting. Greg and I are going to meet with Lisa Lewis and talk to her about doing recruitment. we remind people that everybody recruits, you're all on the team, so, get the word out there. I think the more people that know that the Regent process is available really to anyone, I think is a good thing, whether they advance or not. I've seen it, the political part kind of seesaw back and forth. And when I thought, well, maybe I was new and just naive to it, but I absolutely saw it. And then you see it when it's not as much. So it's hard to predict exactly.
Any follow-up?
No, thank you.
I think this time around, we have 2 at-large positions, and I'm hopeful that that may attract more candidates. You have to,
You've got
3.
Student
student
is
the
at
student
large.
at
is
large,
at
yes,
large.
And 2
and then the 2 at large,
Yeah.
And
right,
then-
and then mine.
and 5, so.
I lost my track. You have to remember that the party in charge, either in the House and the Senate, they are the ones that recruit and nominate people for the RCAT or place people on the RCAT. And whatever party is in charge, they have, a great deal of discretion about who they're going to place on the RCAT. And even though there's a stipulation that a certain percentage has to be from both parties, that does make a difference and influence the makeup of the RCAT as well.
Regent Johnson?
Good, thank you. Just to follow up on that, certainly agree that looking for expertise of different kinds is important. And I think I'll just briefly say that a lot of people have more than one kind of area of expertise, which is also helpful because, people have multiple careers and backgrounds. You were an attorney and a judge, or engineer and an attorney. Doug is an expert in agriculture and business. Mary is nursing and labor union. So we represent and that's good. I think one other thing to keep in mind, and this is a little harder to get at, but I think it's really important, is that our work together is so facilitated by having people who have generally an attitude of cooperation, let's work together, really believe in the common good, how do we find solutions? And I would encourage you to look for simple signs and histories for people's work history where they can have been seen to be collaborative and get good results in their work where they are now, what they're doing by bringing people together. And again, that's not the simplest thing to see, but I think that can be worked out, and I think that's incredibly important. So expertise is one thing, but temperament, character, people that are going to be collaborative, I think that's also really, really important.
Thank you. We haven't made it a requirement of the RCAC members, and maybe we should, but we always remind everybody that these meetings are so accessible. They just are. I mean, you're welcomed if you join. You sit in the back and listen, or you can watch it on YouTube. And I think getting a sense of the work you do and the collaboration and the way people work together as regents, if you're nominating people to be a part of the group, you should have a sense of what the group looks like and how they work. And I say it over and over and over to every new RCAC member, they just need to be a student of the group in a bigger way than I think some of them are. I think some of them, as you say, they kind of have their sense of what they think they should do and who they should recommend.
And I think that collaboration is so important because we certainly don't, as Chair Mayron said, we certainly don't all come with the same plan. We don't all come with the same ideas. We don't all come with the same, path forward and perspectives, but we are all, as a board, willing to sit and ask really thoughtful and contemplative questions respectfully. And I think that's something that I've really appreciated as we sit here, even yesterday during our working session. We're all coming at things from a different perspective, but it is a very respectful, purposeful conversation. And I think finding individuals who are able to not just think critically, but think critically in a respectful and collaborative way is really important. Regent Hemsch.
Can I just
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think, and maybe you could ask some questions, but give us an example of, a situation when you were working, you had people in your work setting that, with whom you had differences of opinion about how things should end up, and how did you manage them? How did you handle that? What was the outcome?
Good question.
Just, can I follow up on Regent Johnson's before
You
you
can,
go?
but poor Regent Hipsch has been so patient, so make it quick.
Okay, I'll make it really quick, I'll talk really
Looking
fast.
forward to Chairman.
We're so
My memory is that we provide, what candidates provide references. And my question is, do members of the committee check those references? Because to get at some of the more subjective characteristics that Regent Johnson's talking about, or Regent Verhalen, it seems to me, you're not gonna figure that out from the candidate itself, him or herself during the interview. But rather probably from the reference checks that you do to find out if this person, what's their style, their temperament, what's their leadership, are they able to create followers? It's, there's no point in being a leader if nobody's gonna follow you. And so if the past is the best predictor of the future, then give examples through the reference checking that you're doing to get at those more subjective qualities, which, to be frank, are as important and sometimes more important than the substantive skill sets we bring to the table.
We do have a subcommittee that does the reference checking, and usually each person on that committee may have two people that they're going to go and check their references and then report back.
But I do think having that reference check, try to get at that, the subjective qualities would be critical.
One last comment on this too, as a member of the, recent member of the presidential search. Doug, you got to talk a lot yesterday. But he just says it in a friendly manner.
He was scripted.
But I was on the presidential search advisory committee, and that was something we took into consideration when we were looking at who we wanted as our president. And you look to see if there's evidence of that, you maybe call people who've worked with them, say, hey, is that the case or not? And so I think all leadership and all that's very important.
Now I hope I say something profound because
Very good.
I mean, it's kind of an awkward perspective because I want to say you did a good job, but
Selecting you.
Yeah, but I guess it's their perspective that matters, not ours. So I agree with everything that's been said. I just hope that, when we start saying we're going to pick so many from one party or so many from another party to be on the committee, we're supposed to be apolitical, okay? I'm not a member of a party, so I wouldn't be picked, because I'm not on one or the other. So I just hope we're listening and watching and learning and listening to the interviews and not making any prejudgments on who we're going to vote for before the interviews even start.
Some of us are. I was recommended to the RCAC by a Republican, and I was continued by a Democrat, so I don't know that they know how I think. I don't know that matters. I think somebody thought I was doing a good job. On the topic of reference checks, I want to say, so we can serve 2 6-year terms, and then we have term limits, so then we're done. And this is the end of my second term, and so I've seen a fair number of them. Reference checks, when I began, we had candidates, and we each raised our hand and said, I'll do reference checks on that person. And you had that person's references, and you called them, and you asked them a bunch of questions, and then you reported back to the RCAC. It was decided that was a bit uneven, that some people were more comfortable with doing those reference checks, some people not so much. Some people did a better job of reporting to the RCAC, some people not so much. So we changed it up. Everybody gives us 3 references, and then we had one centralized person do Sally Olson, the office did the references and reported back to everybody in the same format. And the references were completed by the candidate on the same format. I was kind of doubtful that would work, but I think it worked really well. I think it gave a lot better, and I think the references were very telling. I was surprised at a couple of references where the reference actually said, absolutely not, this is not the person who should be a regent. And I thought, well, this candidate told us this reference, so, I got, thank you, that was, so what we have.
Is that Doug's reference?
Yeah, well, I didn't, not to name any names. We were very impressed with this interview. So the reference checking, I think, has gotten better and more even, but you have to remember that those are people that the candidates have submitted as references. So with an occasional surprising response, most people, their references tell us how fabulous these people are because they've worked with them and they know their strengths and that's what they want. We've talked about and not done it and not actually had funding to maybe do it, is doing some kind of a background check. And that would be a kind of a funding issue. And background checks run the gambit. They can be, I volunteer in our high school in Eden Prairie. They do a background check on me. They make me pay for it. It's $15. It's not very comprehensive. You can switch. But there was one year that 2 candidates had very interesting stories that were reported in the Minneapolis paper that I read in the Minneapolis paper before coming to the RCAC meeting. And I thought, now why am I hearing about this there and not here? And we weren't doing background checks, and we still don't do background checks. So I think by the time you get to that group of maybe 30 people that we interview in person, we should probably afford at some level a background check. I would like to see that.
Thanks for bringing that up. That was a topic that last round we spent quite a bit of time
We spend a lot of
talking about.
time on, everybody's reference, but where do you, they're not going to tell us why they were maybe left their last engagement, or they just aren't. They like to think that there's some time limit where things can't be. I don't know. The Minneapolis paper was doing the reference background checks for us in that year, and I appreciated it.
Regent Turner, and then I also want to give Regent Wheeler an opportunity. So please.
Oh, is she first?
No, you are.
Oh, okay.
But she hasn't even raised her hand, and so I just wanted her to know we see her. I just didn't acknowledge her earlier, so
All right,
go ahead.
thank you, Chair Helen. So I don't think you can get away from the so-called political. I mean, it's an extremely political process. I mean, it's the one of 2 times that you all gather in the chamber and vote. I mean, which is kind of, we're only one of 2 states, right, that do it that way?
Legislatures do, yeah.
Yeah, so
Not us.
that's kind of, having been recently through it, it's kind of a cool thing, sit up in the balcony and, but and having in the past decade worked a lot with one party, I want to tag off of what Regent Hips is saying, that it's kind of nice to come to a board where you feel free to interact with both parties. I was always free to talk to whoever I want, but just to be able to be that nonpartisan, which I just want to make that observation. I keep wanting to call you senator, but that's a really nice position to be, where you're not having to do one loyalty or the other. The other thing I would say is I having been around the legislature for a while, I trust that most of the legislators are fairly intelligent looking at the general population and looking at this board and deciding what is needed. Now, could they use a little help as far as what you're saying, we have an expertise, someone from the judicial or a lawyer, that kind of thing, to be able to pinpoint maybe a few things that would be helpful. But I trust our legislators to have the pulse of the people and to come up with people, because the region and boards in general are being called upon more and more to be interacting with the people. Okay? And so I just think it's important to have people who serve who want to be amongst the people. I realize I'm learning that in the university world, the Board of Regents is kind of way up here and historically has been unknown and kept separate and things like that. But I don't know if the population or our people will tolerate that. And I don't know if it serves our higher ed and all the things that we need to do and how we need to save higher ed, just like we need to save healthcare. It doesn't help to be separated. So I would put my plug in for people that are willing to go the extra mile when they can, to be amongst, to interact with the people, and that being everyone involved in higher ed. So that's my plug for that.
Regent Wheeler?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
We can, great.
Okay, good. I'm using a new headphones. First of all, let me just say that the two who are sitting at the table, I just really appreciate you. You know, you have been grounding forces for the RCAC for a long time, and Barb, and you know, it worries me that you're actually terming out. So we need somebody just like you and former Senator Clausen. You've been great. So thank you very much for that. It is. I think most of the things have been mentioned. The politicization of the process is really difficult, and I think. Having just experienced it, you know what I mean, and I appreciate Board Chair Miran trying to emphasize that for the body as well. I think that most things have been said, but what I would do is encourage you to, as has been said, you know, favor competency over people who are representationally seated, because we have to think of the broad university. And the second thing I would say is my favorite quote about governance is, you know, and knowing the difference between governance and management is have people who are able to get their arms around things without their fingers inextricably in them. And that's one of your criteria is knowing governance. And then lastly, I'll say, I think that the character part is hugely important. So I love that as part of the competency check. But I'd say that somebody with some leadership experience, we're entering into a time where we're going to do a multi-year strategic plan. And so somebody who has some kind of knowledge of, you know, helping to chart ways and has the leadership experience and the support of doing so would be helpful as well. But thank you to you too, and thank you for being present at the committee today.
Thank you.
So we have just a couple minutes left. I guess I wanted to offer, yeah.
Just one last comment. The comment by Regent Wheeler about the yeah, the
Now I can't say it.
political it's gotten, all right.
Politicization.
I think it prevents good people from applying for the position.
Yeah.
And so as I'm thinking about what will get communicated to RCAC when you're looking for candidates and mining the field, one of the issues that why people don't run is because it's just so political, and they understand how daunting the process it is to meet with all these legislators, and then, for example, to get to the actual convention, have somebody nominated from the floor who wasn't vetted. And so anything that the RCAC can do to depoliticize, there we go, the process, I think is critical just for seeking applicants.
Yeah, I mean, that nearly kept me from applying. I wasn't involved in politics. I didn't have contacts. My representative had just changed 3 months before that. So it was a very kind of a hurdle to jump in and say, okay, I'm going to put my application in. Let's see where this goes. Regent Wheeler, I saw your hand up, and then we'll offer one closing opportunity.
I just wanted to give a point of you know, emphasis of Board Chair Miran's last point, in that, you know, when I was selected, everybody knows it was a tie vote the first time, you know, in the chamber, and I had a bunch of people come up to me from the party that voted differently that said, oh, Penny, this wasn't about you, it was about, you know, one party over another. It's like, well, it should be about the University of Minnesota and the state of Minnesota. So that's just a story to emphasize, you know, how challenging it's become, and hopefully we can be better versions of ourselves as this goes forward. So thank you.
So I'll offer our guests one last opportunity if there's anything else you want to leave us with, or anything else you want Chair Miran and Executive Director Steves to be ready to discuss with the RCAC when they come and meet with you.
Well, I think it is always helpful for a member of the board to come to us and talk about specific needs on the board, and that is helpful. So we look forward to that. And you know, other than that, we've got quite a few positions to fill on RCAT as well. So we're working on that right now. So that'll be happening as well. And I've got to give a a shout out to Regent Doug, because I've never really learned how to pronounce your last name.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
Oops.
Yeah.
I've been criticized many times, but when you interviewed with the ARCAT, what he did was he took us on a journey in his hometown. And he talked about all the things that the University of Minnesota influenced on that town in northern Minnesota. And I thought just that was terrific. It pointed out the importance of the University of Minnesota, how it touches so many lives, makes things better for our state, and I really appreciated that. So I've been thinking about that I wanted to give a shout out to you on that, so thank you.
Well, thank you for that, but I think the rest of these guys are getting sick of hearing about it, so. Appreciate that, thank you.
I agree. You told us you were creating a retail destination in northern Minnesota, and I thought, am I going there to shop? Really? Because I don't fish, I don't do other things, but maybe he's got something here. So I loved your enthusiasm, and years later, we all remember your interview.
More people need to recognize that, the importance of the university and the daily lives of so many of our citizens.
It's everywhere in the state, you know, we need it everywhere, so.
Yeah, thank you.
Before you leave, I would be remiss if I didn't give our president an opportunity to weigh in on this conversation, and so my apologies for.
That's okay. My first point is I'm delighted to work with whoever is chosen. Some just high-level pieces. Unless you've actually worked in higher ed administration, for example, like Mary Davenport, it's hard to understand the depth of the complexity of the university at first blush. And so certainly folks that have an appreciation and a like of complexity is really important, and also of gray areas, because there's also very few things here that are as black and white as one might come into, either with a representational or a particular stance coming forward, and the ability to dig into those questions in a complex way, I think is really important. Also, just on your other representation, I would encourage you, because you're talking to Lisa Lewis, we have alumni associations also at Duluth and at Crookston. And so I would encourage you to talk to those alumni associations separately also, and to find people, as we look for people across the state that might help.
Yeah, those are wonderful suggestions. Thank you. Well, thank you both for your time. Thank you to the Regents and President Cunningham for this conversation and reminding me that you were sitting over there, so my apologies.
There you go.
But
Mostly gonna say nothing, but yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you for so much.
And
Well, yes,
the
and
process starts.
in case I don't see you before your term is up, thank you for the time you've given to this committee. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you both.
All right,
And thank you to Regent Mayron for her leadership as she's going off board. Appreciated working with you. Thank you.
Thanks. So our second item today is to review the proposed amendments to the board's committee structure in Board of Regents policy, board operations, and agenda guidelines, or BOAG, as Jason is trying to make happen. Presenting this item are Executive Director Steves and Associate Secretary Langworthy. Executive Director Steves, would you like to start us off?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, and BOAG has been around well before Jason was here. Actually, former Executive Director Ann Cieslak taught me that term. So the amendments that are before you today are intended to reflect the conversations that have been had in this committee, not just in recent months, but actually even last year. We've been talking about kind of the committee structure and how this board wants to accomplish work through its committees for a couple of years now, as experiments have been taking place with the creation of special committees, and some of the portfolios have shifted a bit. And so today what we have in front of you are what we believe are the consensus items. These are the areas where the committee has found some common ground around elevating the Special Committee on Academic Health to be a standing committee, to codify a couple of the committees as full 12-person committees, and to just clarify some of the roles and expectations around standing committees versus special committees. And so that is all here today, and we would be remiss if we opened a policy and didn't do some housekeeping cleanup, and so we have some of that in here as well. And so with that kind of introduction, I believe Mr. Langworthy is going to walk through some of the specific language so that you can see what we've proposed.
Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, good morning. We'll jump right to page 8 of your document materials, to the bottom of the page, and hit those high points that Executive Director Steves just outlined. So starting in section 4, you can see this is where we are adding language on the role of standing committees, and then a lot of additional language on the role of special committees. There isn't much language in your bylaws around special committees, and there hadn't been much language in BOAG either. It's vintage. That's bringing back BOAG. It's vintage. So we're adding that language here in that section to give some guidance to future board chairs and boards as they think about using special committees as has been done recently. Moving down then in that same section in what would become subdivision 4, this is where we are codifying that the standing committees of the board have the following membership in terms of number of regions. So this is codifying that finance and operations and mission fulfillments would be committees of all 12 regions, and the other committees would be committees of 6. Right in the next subdivision, this is where then we would add academic health as the standing committee. So elevating it from its special committee, we heard from this committee the desire and the need to have continued board oversight and engagement in this area. And it felt like the right time to elevate that into a standing committee. You'll see that the committee's charge is very similar to the charge letter, Chair Mayron, that you used to create the committee. And certainly this can evolve and change as the board takes actions on the clinical enterprise and other areas. So it's a little bit broad right now, but it could certainly continue to be refined as that standing committee begins its formal work. Then we'll jump all the way down to page 14 to section 5. So there are a number of the housekeeping items that Executive Director Steve said we can certainly respond to any questions on those. But moving down to section 5, noting that board meetings, in addition, board meetings of its standing or special committees, regular meeting agendas may include work sessions, public forums, and engagement activities. That's to align with discussions that the board has been having, and also just to clean up a little bit of the language. We had work sessions, open forums, and public hearings, so to align with current practice. And you'll see later in that section, and you'll see throughout, we're then adding reference to academic health as that new standing committee, and that it typically meets 6 times a year. That guidance there at the bottom of page 14 is usually, so it doesn't mean that committees couldn't meet more or less. It's just simply, this is sort of the rough guidance that the policy is providing. Moving on to the top of the next page under meeting procedures, review and action, we just cleaned up this language around consent reports and when a regent may ask questions or make comments before a motion and then ask for an item to be separated out. You saw this happen yesterday in finance and operations, and so this language aligns to current practice. We just felt like this was a good cleanup. Then in that same section on the bottom of page 15, we're updating a little bit the staff responsibilities for the senior leader committee liaison based on the way that current practice is between board leadership and the president, and adding in there a placeholder right now. Again, these are typical officers, senior leader officers, but these are designated by the board chair and the president. So these can change, but that's at least the items there. And you can see we've also updated senior vice president for finance and operations to executive there. And then finally, I'll just jump down to the top of page 17 and just note again here on the agenda development, this is to update to current practice that board leadership and the president are using for how the Agenda 2 meeting works. The Agenda 2 meeting is the meeting at which the board chair approves the board agenda. So just making adjustments and refinements there based on current practice. And so with that, the all of the amendments are up for review today, and we would be happy to answer any questions you might have on them. I'll also note in the Audit and Compliance Committee yesterday, they were discussing the thresholds around external engagement. So with auditors, either the university's principal external auditor or other audit firms, the committee endorsed making some changes to those thresholds. So we will incorporate those changes that the committee has endorsed between review and, if ready for action in December, to the draft there. So those would update the approval threshold, remove the dollar amount for the independent auditor, and make impairment sort of the threshold there when the administration feels that the audit firm's independence may be impaired. And so I would recommend the Audit and Compliance Committee YouTube for viewing, and then those changes will be incorporated in for action potentially in December. So thank you, Chair Verhalen.
So just so I'm clear, when this comes for action as the next item, as you prepare those board materials, you'll call out those changes then as a result of the audit and compliance discussion that will be incorporated?
Yes, we will. And they'll also be reported to the full board during the committee report later
Great.
today.
As people gather their thoughts, I did have one question for you, and you didn't touch on this change. If you can go to section 3, subdivision 1, the addition of the word, page 7, the addition of the word "the." Can you help us understand?
Are you being cocky?
I'm being totally facetious. I'm just giving people
Yes,
time.
governing documents, yes. Yes, we, board exercises its authority. We thought the board exercises its authority would be helpful. We are checking with Ohio State, though, if we can use the, given their
That was my biggest concern.
Yeah, I know, I appreciate that.
I think it's just if we put it in all caps that it's a problem.
Correct. Well, I mean, we'll have OGC run that down for us, but yes.
Well, but I mean, they're the Ohio State, we could just be the Board of Regents, then it's just, that is the Board of Regents.
In all seriousness, are there any questions? Yes, Regent Mayron.
I have two comments. The first one relates to page 14, where subdivision 2, this is section 5, subdivision 2 on committee meetings. That's the language, committees usually meet as follows, and lays out what we've been doing. I recognize this is discretionary, doesn't mean it has to be this way, but I think governance and policy we should be saying the same. It should be 6 times a year. If we don't have anything to do, we can cancel the meeting. But to be frank, the way it's currently set up, the last time we meet will be in February, and then governance and policy doesn't meet until June. And that's a long time, and we've had very robust agendas over the last couple of years, and I don't think that they're going to go away. I think a variety of issues will come up in this committee. So I would suggest treating governance and policy the same way. I recognize that as we work on that because of who's on what committee, that may be creating some issues, and maybe it's not something we can adopt right away. We need to wait until the committees are reassigned in July, but I think on a going forward basis, this committee should be meeting 6 times a year. If we don't need it, you could cancel it. And then the second comment I have is at page 17. And this may show up other places, but when we get to the board, to the bylaws, we will be talking about, I'll be making a comment about the vice chair position. And just to preview it, I think it has worked really well to have 2 vice chairs along with the chair. And so if that gets adopted or changed, then I would suggest wherever in the language here of this policy, we change the word chair to chairs or vice chairs and make it plural. And so under agenda development subdivision, which was subdivision 1, subsection B, we talk about the vice chair, and I think we should, I'm hoping we'll entertain what we're currently doing. I think it's worked really well. So those are my 2 comments.
So I'm going to offer a contrarian viewpoint on your suggested revision to changing governance and policy to meet 6 times a year, because on the flip side of that, the board chair can ask the committees to meet whatever you would like. We could meet 7 times a year as committees. And so the other side of that is this is, usually meets this many times, but we could meet as, setting out a work plan and decide that governance and policy needs to meet 7 times that year and audit and compliance needs to meet 8 times. And so I wouldn't necessarily change this to change the expectation, because looking at these, yes, it says usually meets as follows. This has traditionally become the minimal expectation then of each of those committees. And so that's just my other viewpoint. So Regent Johnson, you
I
had your
just had
hand
a
up.
question on that, because I wonder, the asymmetries just seems kind of odd. All the others are 6 and 12, and that's, so I understand what you're saying totally, but it just seems like it's being called out as being different or like lesser, and I don't see it that way
No,
at all.
this is the most important committee,
Right, of course, that's what I was thinking.
based on YouTube views. Executive Director Steve.
Madam Chair,
The history of this.
Regent Johnson, part of this is, there's some artifacts of history that are at play in this. It used to be that there was more variation between committees. There used to also be more concurrent committees that met, where you would have, 6-person committees meeting opposite one another, finance and then facilities and things like that. The reason governance and policy, which is is the youngest of the standing committees until this new one is created, the reason it was meeting 5 times a year is to create some room for some other board activity that is traditionally in your calendar, namely the recognitions that you do. So it was to create room for recognitions, which takes about the equivalent time of this committee to have that hosted each year. And so that was why it historically happened that way. But as Regent Mayron notes, as committees get reconstituted, especially in the next cycle, governance may not end up meeting on Friday mornings. It may meet opposite a different committee. It may do other things. And so certainly the number of meetings may be adjusted.
And just to respond, Regent Mayron, on the vice chair piece, that is an area that we have teed up in our next conversation. If there were to be a change where the board wanted to move to vice chairs, there are a number of places in board policy that will need adjustments. And so we will, include in any action, right, if that was, an amendment to the bylaw, we would also have a direction then to the Office of the Board of Regents to go in and to make the necessary adjustments across the entire suite. So we didn't want to assume any action here, so that's why we haven't touched the vice chair language.
Any other reaction to the proposed changes to the policy other than what's been expressed so far? Yes,
I
Regent
agree
Hitch.
with them.
Pardon?
I agree with them,
You agree with these changes?
yes.
Any opinion on treating governance different than the other committees of 6?
No opinion.
Okay.
I don't think it matters if we change it or not, because we can still meet as many or a few times as we want, so.
I will say one of the reasons, apart from the fact, I understand traditionally why it ended up at 5, but we can address the issue of when we do awards or where we're gonna do them. And I would hate to see that drive our business if we need to meet. And as I said, the other reason for saying 6 is that then when the board office is working on the actual schedule, it gets on our calendar as opposed to having to schedule a special meeting or something like that to address. And that's why I would rather see this committee be treated no differently. But I think substantively, we just have more work to do, and waiting from February till June just is way too long, in my experience, since I've been on this, chairing this committee and now vice chair of this committee. So in any event, that's a proposal that I would. Any other thoughts, or Regent Wheeler, on the proposed changes, pro, con, any other changes you identified?
No, I agree with the changes, and I agree that we have the flexibility whether it's 5 or stated as 6. So I'm okay either way.
Okay, back to you, Chair
I don't
Verhillen.
know what I just walked back into.
You're going on
What
to
did
the
you
next
commit to?
topic. We were talking about you. You have, you're gonna be chairing for 12 meetings a year.
This is so important.
Yeah.
Great. Regent Kenyanya, I understand you've requested a moment of our time,
If
so
you'd allow it, Madam Chair.
I will. But we do need to move on to the next item, so please go ahead.
Okay,
Maybe.
Why don't you come
oh,
up to the table?
wow.
Just because
okay.
the microphones are here,
This
so.
is, okay. It is scary around this side, Madam President. No, real quick, I mean, I just want to comment, definitely support the enshrinement of the Academic Health Committee. Question on that one would be, I anticipate as our ongoing negotiations and other things mature, that some further definement of the committee would be needed, right? Because other committees have certain authorities, certain reports that have to go there. None of that is included here. So we anticipate further policy changes.
Yeah, one of the conversations we've had is because the role of that committee is in flux, even though we understand that that committee will continue to be necessary, that's exactly it is. We'll need to develop what their charge is, and their guardrails are for purposes of committee action versus administrative action.
Okay, thank you. And then one last comment. And this, you know, I think the board may have settled on this committee being a committee of 6. I still feel that, you know, should the schedule allow, this may be the one that makes sense, another one that makes sense to be a committee of the whole. Chair Verhalen, if you remember the Kenyanya Verhalen compromise at our retreat last year, that was the framework for the special committees. You know, we discussed the difference, you know, we definitely need to delegate and be able to do more things and trust other colleagues, but this being the one committee that governs ourselves, it would be nice to be a committee of the whole. However, as we add other special committees, we have to give somewhere, right? So if the schedule doesn't allow that, totally makes sense. If it does, I still think it may be worth exploring.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right, we will move on to our next item. Our last item today is an overview of the board's bylaws and discussion of potential amendments to the bylaws. So providing an overview are again Executive Director Steves and Associate Secretary Langworthy. Executive Director Steves, we'll have you start.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, as we previewed in the work plan, the bylaws are up for a comprehensive review this year. And so this is the first stage in that conversation and update process. The bylaws, as were noted, I think in some of the previous presentations you've seen, are the second highest level of governing authority. So the charter is your top level, and the bylaws are second, and then the board policies fall below that. So they're also your second oldest set of governing document, or governing document. It dates to 1889. It operationalizes in many ways some of the items that are articulated in the university's charter. And so it establishes how officers are selected. It does a number of other things like that. And so, and has some basic meeting procedures in it. As we've just been talking about with board operations and agenda guidelines, and as this committee previously dealt with on reservation delegation of authority, you know that those board policies really build out a lot of the detail around that. Some boards have all of that type of language in their bylaws. This board over time has evolved to have a more lean set of bylaws and then have those policies build out a lot more of that detail. But obviously that would be up to you as a committee to decide if you want to continue in that fashion. So this policy also at least touches on and starts to talk about how authority is delegated. As a reminder, always, the board is the ultimate authority for how the university operates, and you delegate authority through the president to manage the affairs of the university. And so all of these documents that we're dealing with, they get at one of those 4 fundamental questions that I've always talked to you about in terms of being an important role of the board. your role, among other things, is to identify who's responsible for actually carrying out the mission and the activities and the management of the university, and you articulate that through your delegations, and that begins with these bylaws. So with that, I believe we're going to walk through the sections of the bylaws and talk to you more about what's in them.
Yeah, so hopefully everyone has their coffee. Associate Secretary over there.
I mean, unneeded when talking about bylaws, right? Just the excitement.
I was more concerned about everyone else.
Yeah, fair. So we'll walk through the sections just to give you a flavor of what is included here. So certainly an introduction that notes the territorial laws from 1851 and then perpetuated by the Constitution of the State of Minnesota, Article 3, Section 3. Article 1, 2 really talk about sort of general parameters, right? That the name of the body corporate shall be Regents of the University of Minnesota, and that the authority and responsibility for the government of the University of Minnesota is vested in the Board of 12 Regents. Article 3 then defines the officers of the Board of Regents, and those are the Chancellor as ex officio president, that's the way that it's referred to in the charter. The chair, the vice chair, and the secretary and the treasurer make up the officers of the Board of Regents. Then it talks about the term of office, the duties and responsibilities for those officers, how elections are held, and what happens in the case of a vacancy of an office. And this is where certainly when we get to our potential areas of review, having a conversation around the vice chair, and if it should be 1 or 2 or 6, however you would want to frame that. And then we also have another question as well that we'll get to in terms of the election cycle for the secretary and treasurer. Article 4 then, meetings of the Board of Regents. This is where the bylaws define what your annual meeting is, which is the meeting that takes place in June. The second Friday in June of every year is the annual meeting. And in odd number years, that's where officers are elected. And then regular meetings. And the order of business for regular meetings, so this is your meeting on Friday, is set by the bylaws. And so that's why, for example, in March or July, when committees don't meet, we still have to list reports of committees on the agenda because it is a required item in the order of business. Then special meetings are talked about there, that they are called may be called by the chair of the board or via a written request of any 5 members. And that request then has to be granted, and a special meeting must be held within 30 days of that request. Article 5 then are committees of the Board of Regents, and so this talks about standing committees, nominating committees, and special committees. And the standing committees, it's noted that the responsibilities of standing committees are noted in board operations and agenda guidelines, which we just talked about. Article 6, rules of procedure. Everyone's favorite section A names Robert's Rules of Order as our parliamentary manual. The fact that the board abides by open meeting law, what is considered a quorum, voting the question, which is for everything with the exception of 2 items. It's a majority voting on the question, and so that's defined here. And then section E defines the types of business before the board. A reference to board operations and agenda guidelines is again included here. This is also the section that you have been discussing around public input, where the request procedure is contained. We talked about that last month, so I won't get into that again today, but that is the section, and based on that conversation, where some adjustments would be proposed. The other pieces, there are some protocol for meetings of the Board of Regents that are adopted for purposes of Minnesota statute, and then definition for how we capture the approved minutes, and then guidance on telephone or video meetings. Article 7, delegation of authority. So these are broad delegations. So section A is a broad delegation to the president, executive officers, and administrators in alignment with Board of Regents policy, reservation, and delegation of authority. It also makes clear as the highest authority that can act on behalf of the Board of Regents is the General Counsel's ultimate client, unless the board were to direct otherwise. Section B then is a broad delegation to the president, university senate, and faculties for all matters relating to the education and administrative affairs of the university, including those incident to the management of the student body, are committed to the president, the university senate, and the several faculties as provided in the Senate Constitution and amended from time to time. So this sets the structure for the university's shared governance of those areas of the education and management of our students. Section 8 are miscellaneous potpourri provisions. So Section A is the code of conduct, that you have to have a code of conduct. I'll note that you can suspend the bylaws, every other part of the bylaws except for this section. You cannot suspend having a code of conduct. Reimbursement for expenses, and then Section C was an area that was added in 2018. What happens if a quorum of the board is unable to discharge the duties of the board? So if there was an emergency, if there was a pandemic, if for some reason something happened, and until the governor were to fill any vacancies created because of that emergency, it is articulated in here what the board can and cannot do. Finally, Article 9, how to amend your bylaws. And then Article 10, suspension of the bylaws. As I just mentioned, the board can suspend their bylaws with the exception of having a code of conduct. And so then the items that at least we've identified as potential areas for review. So interest certainly in codifying the multiple vice chairs. Currently, the president for officers, as I mentioned, president, chair, vice chair, secretary, treasurer. The president and the secretary and treasurer are tied to positions within the university. And so currently, you elect the president when you hire and appoint the president, and the president continues to serve as the president until the president is no longer serving in that position. Hopefully not for a very long time.
That's different than what I understood.
Yeah, great. Yeah, you don't need to run for re-election every 2 years, but the secretary and the treasurer do. And you'll see later today with the action that the Finance and Operations Committee took yesterday to appoint a new executive vice president for finance and operations. That position has traditionally also been the treasurer. And so I think our question is, should we make clear, much like the president, that the secretary and treasurer continue to hold those officer positions as long as they hold their underlying university positions. So for the secretary, that's as the executive director of the Office of the Board of Regents, and again, as treasurer, that's the executive vice president for finance and operations. Adjust the order of business. If there are any adjustments to that Friday order of business, certainly while we have the bylaws open, we could do that. I'll note the original version of the bylaws from 1889 called it unfinished business instead of old business, which is the technical term that should be used. So more vintage throwbacks for going back to 1889. And then we also want to see if you would like to clarify any committee charge language. There's a little bit of overlap in the bylaws right now. One of the responsibilities of the chair is to name and identify the duties and responsibilities of all committees and fill committee vacancies, appoint all members to those committees. Then later in the bylaws, we also talk about the board naming those responsibilities and doing so through board operations and agenda guidelines. So we may just want to clean up those two references to be in alignment with who does that work, if it's the chair or if it's the full board in terms of the responsibilities. Current practice is that the board comes together and names those standing committees and the responsibilities. And then we talked about the request to appear provision last month. So we certainly, that is on our radar. And then other areas that you might have, and we would certainly welcome your comments and suggestions. And so that, Chair Verhalen, we're happy to hear that input.
Sure. So while folks get themselves added to the list, just a couple thoughts on the outset. On codifying multiple vice chairs, I'm glad to hear that it's worked well and that it's been successful. One thing it has served us well over the last 2 years, year or so. I wouldn't necessarily want there to be an expectation that there will always be vice chairs. And so, thinking about it in the concept of, or co-vice chairs if so elected, wherever vice chair shows up, and making those provisions. I would fully support. It was a parliamentarian hopscotch game to actually get us here, and I'm really glad we did, because there was so much going on at the time to make sure that we had sufficient coverage on a number of issues. I don't see a reason to not tie those positions to as so employed in those positions, instead of going through the process of electing them every 2 years. That feels very strange. And the other items, I don't have any super strong feelings on, other than I would like to use the actual appropriate language in Robert's rules, so unfinished business would be my preference, but that's merely my wonkiness. So Regent Mayron, I'll hand it off to you.
All right. So I'm walking through the bullets. You've identified the issues that I wanted to take up. As you can see, as you all remember, I wasn't in favor of having two co-vice chairs. I thought it would be cumbersome, but it's worked out terrifically, and I think having that option and codifying that option, that it could be one or two, not more than that, one or two vice chairs, that we have the ability to do that when you're doing elections of officers, I think is a really good idea. As to tying it, the second bullet, I agree doing, let's tie it to the position, and as long as the person is in that position and the administration, then they would play that role on the board. Adjusting the order of business, I don't have an opinion on it. And if there are any particular suggestions, certainly open to it. Same with the clarifying the committee charge language, if necessary, then let's take a look at it. Nothing comes to mind right now. In terms of modifying the request to appear before the board, the second to the last bullet, if we are going to maintain that section in there that it is the board, the chair has the, it's a decision by the chair, I think that we should put in language that lays out the criteria that the board chair will consider and when making that decision, so that we have some agreement under what circumstances a board chair would at least look at it and decide whether to grant appearance or not. And at the last meeting, I talked about at least the criteria I used in my head to grant the request for the Palestinian divest group and why it didn't for the gymnasts. But I think having some clarifying language and setting out criteria for a board chair to consider, I think would be very helpful to the board chair in particular, who's ever board chair.
I think it would be helpful to those making the request, as far as understanding what criteria would be used in evaluating that type of request.
And building on that, then anybody making the request, that they would address those criteria in writing in their request, so that we're not guessing at it. But, for example, given you've communicated to us via email or the virtual form, a variety of different ways already, what is it that appearing before the board will add to the equation beyond how you've already communicated to us, why you think it will make a difference? And so I think it'd be important to ask the requesters to address those criteria as well. And I don't mean to say that the board chair should be, it's only those criteria, but I do think it's important to begin to verbalize why decisions are being made to allow people to appear in that.
Other thoughts? Sure, Regent Turner.
Let's see. I fully agree with the two vice chairs, and I think we should codify it. That means put it in stone,
Put it in writing.
kind of thing, right? I think at the time, any board I've ever been on has had like an executive committee, and I really appreciate it. If I couldn't hear from Chair Mayron, Regent Hipsch had calls from you, and I don't know, Mike, is he still here? I don't know if I heard from him or not, but anyway, I appreciated the ability to have more than one person to get to you. So I totally agree that we should keep that. As I want to jump down to Claire, the modifying the requests thing. I have a question. Who would come up with this list of criteria? Would it be all of us?
So my,
Because we had it, when we had this discussion.
Yep.
I know that Chair Mayron and I had a difference of opinion as to what constitutes a good purpose for coming. And I stand by this, that sometimes the reason to come is to be able to have a face-to-face and to realize that you've been heard. And that's maybe not a real glamorous or a very concrete decision, but I wouldn't want that to be lost. That human need to be seen and heard.
yeah, so from a process standpoint, I think the thought is that this committee would initially develop what those criteria could be, come to an agreement on what those would be, and then make a recommendation to the board for full action, because the full board has to vote on any changes of our bylaws. Other thoughts?
I guess I would just
Yeah, Regent
follow
Johnson.
up on the vice chair thing. I think it's been fantastic, but I would agree with Chair Mayron that I wouldn't codify it, because I think we have the flexibility to look at the circumstances of our leadership positions and decide if one or two is the best at that time.
So would codify
No,
it. No, I meant, but right now the bylaws only talk about the election of a vice chair. And
Yeah.
so what this is proposing is allowing, the bylaws
Yeah.
allowing for the election of one or two vice
Flexibility,
chairs.
yeah, flexibility.
And you would be supportive of
Absolutely,
that.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, because if you remember when we went about this, we had to suspend the bylaws
Right,
and make
yeah,
a
that's
series of, basically
Yeah.
a standing side amendment to the bylaws that would be in place for this 2-year period. And so this would,
Yeah,
what it would really do is codify that flexibility to say vice chair or vice chairs, so it wouldn't.
no, that's
we
fine. I
wouldn't
didn't want
have
to
do everything.
mandate that it had to be, but
Correct.
this is perfect. I agree.
Regent Turner?
Okay, thank you, Chair Hanlon. Going back to the whole vice chair, and I think one thing that appealed to our sense of the whole board being involved was part of the reason why having, creating a bigger inner sphere in the two vice chairs and the chair. It gives the appearance and the feel that there is more representation of the board in between board meetings. And so that's why I would advocate for having two vice chairs. And I mean, normally boards have chair, vice president, well, they do, except a couple of our positions are university positions. But these would normally be an inner circle of like an executive board. The treasurer, the secretary, the vice president, a larger group of the board that's representing the whole board in between the board meetings.
So the reason I hesitate to support codifying that there must be co-vice chairs, that there must be two vice chairs, is once it is put in the bylaws, it cannot be changed but for a 2/3 majority vote. And thinking through a whole wide variety of circumstances, there could be a situation where it would not serve this board well to have two co-vice chairs. Instead, it may actually make more sense to suspend the bylaws and create some sort of other executive committee, et cetera. And so my parliamentarian governance core would much rather see the bylaws contemplate the potential existence of co-vice chairs so that the board can decide what is best for the board at the time. Because the board will still have to decide whether to elect one or two vice chairs, but the board as a collective then would be making that decision of what is best for that board at that time. I don't want to necessarily bind future boards to having to have 2 co-vice chairs unless they suspend or change the bylaws. So that's where I come from on that. Regent Hipsch.
Yes, I agree with the first 2 points. I think the 2 vice chairs has worked well. There's a lot of things we have to decide between meetings, and it's just good to have more opinions on that. I think we've all changed our minds in those talks, just working it out, and I think it's really important. Not that we make all the right decisions, obviously, we're just people, but we try our best. So on the request to appear before the board, I'm really concerned about opening that up too much where everybody wants to appear before the board and we get into management issues versus governance issues. Because a lot of the stuff where people are requesting to get on, it's more something that the president and her staff should take care of, not necessarily a governance issue. And we have thousands of different people that would want to come and talk to the board directly. And we really have to be careful that we don't open that up, so the whole meeting is dealing with stuff that aren't governance type issues. So that's my concern there. So I agree with changing the provisions, but the devil's in the details on how we do that. So we want to make sure that we get that one right, so.
Other thoughts? So in summary, what I'm hearing is that there's a desire to codify the potential for multiple vice chairs, noting Regent Turner's preference to codify that there would always be 2 vice chairs. So my suggestion would be that we proceed with seeing revisions that would allow for 2 co-vice chairs, although not mandate co-vice chairs, and then we can react to it. Regent Turner, is that okay? We can see how it looks and see how it feels and think on this a little bit more. Is that okay with everyone? Okay.
We have a thumbs up from Regent Wheeler.
If I may follow up, what you said after when you were doing that paragraph, and you kind of said, because it could potentially even look even more different, depending on what group of regents you had. I believe you alluded to it could look like an expanded, even more expanded, depending on the situation. So then that gave me a little bit more assurance of what you're talking about.
Okay. And I appreciate you following up on that. I'm hearing a preference of the committee to tie the officer positions to the administrative position tenure. I'm hearing no real preference on changing the order of business, other than let's call it what it is meant to be called. But otherwise, as you're evaluating, if there's anything else, I would say this committee is open to you bringing other items before us as necessary. And then we should add to a future work session of this committee discussing what those parameters would be for the request to appear before the board or any of its committees, so that we can add some guidance to not only how the chair or whatever we decide would make that decision, but also to our stakeholders and understanding what goes into making that decision to appear before the board. And I haven't heard any other areas for suggestion. Is there anything I missed in that summation?
Excellent.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, Executive Director Steves.
And so you have something to react to. We'll come forward with something so that you have some criteria in front of you, and you can say, those criteria are terrible. Why did you guys put that in front of us? But we'll put something in front of you just so that you have something to react to and chew on and give us feedback on. So that we'll give you a starting point.
Wonderful. All right, there being any last moment, sorry. There being no other business before this board, we are adjourned a minute and a half early. 9:45 in the boardroom.